Yeah, thank you, Margarita, for introduction. And yeah, as you said, I'm currently working as an intern at the project and present today my master thesis, actually on topic trust in governments during pandemic, during the actual events that concern all of us somehow, and trying to analyze what factors impact the trust. So I will share my screen, if you don't mind. So, all right. First of all, a brief introduction and outline. So, in this research, we were interested in the questions on why and how the trust is formulated during the pandemic and what factors can explain its formation. The sub-questions which we're interested is where if trust diverged more among countries during the pandemic or among individuals, and how the perceptions of economy influence the formation of trust during the pandemic. And contextually, especially when the pandemic started, most of the states have introduced states of emergency. And during such circumstances, executives usually hold more power than usual. And these are governments, especially in European context, who manage the pandemic, who introduce lockdown policies and now trying to hold vaccination campaigns. And considering all that, and especially considering the fact that pandemic started to last more than probably some of us expected at the beginning, it is interesting to analyze how perceptions of economy impact formation of trust, and how people's economic situations impact their trust in governments. And from the academic perspective, I try to combine two layers of scientific literature, one dedicated to economic voting and clarity of responsibility, especially, which presumed that economy actually determines trust in incumbents, and the other two crises, because the economic voting literature provides really fruitful findings to consider, but it doesn't really cover the situation of crises and unexpected events. And preliminary finding, and probably the main finding, is the interaction between economy and especially unemployment during pandemic and clarity of responsibility. And we found that people who lost the job permanently during the pandemic tend to distrust in governments higher, in systems where clarity of responsibility is better. Meaning when the governments are more united and more coherent during pandemic, people can better understand that it's probably the government who can be responsible for economy and their own economy especially. While other responses who didn't really feel the economic consequences of a pandemic, or slightly feel it, and feel it on subjective level, for example, anxiety, job anxiety, but not actually loss of a job, they more appreciate united governments during pandemic times. And this finding partially disagree with clarity of responsibility literature, which suppose that trust is lower in less polarized contexts, that trust is lower under more coherent governments. It turns out that in pandemic times, it's the opposite. People actually evaluate more coherent actors who can probably respond to a pandemic faster. And first of all, I analyzed the theory I analyze the theory, and first of all, it's a theory on trust formation and classic definition of diffuse and specific trust by Easton, and later on, Norris elaborated on his definition and distinguished 5 levels of system support. And trust in governments occupies the lowest levels among these, and I try to focus this thesis only on trust in governments as part of specific support. And theories on trust formation in general can be distinguished on institutional and cultural ones, while culture suppose that trust drives from people's socialization and culture in general. Institutional perspective is that people evaluate institutional performance and especially economic performance on the macro level, and the individual and social demographic factors explain how they made these evaluations. And the precise focus is on institutional perspective in this study. And next, I try to combine the two layers of literature, as I said previously, on economic voting and on crisis situation. And while the classic economic voting suppose that economy definitely determines incumbent support, there are also political factors that shape this relationship. And here especially I focus on definition by Hobholt and her co-authors of institutional and governmental clarity. Institutional clarity is the relationship between different branches of power. And this is generally supposed that trust is higher in consensual democratic systems, because these systems, first of all, ensure greater representation of opinions, and second, because they have very blurred institutional designs, people don't really understand how all of these institutions work, and they face more challenges to assign responsibility for certain policies. While in majoritarian systems, usually two-party systems or systems led by a single party, trust is supposed to be lower because people, first of all, better understand that it's probably this concrete party they voted for is responsible for economic policies or other policies. However, the vital contribution of Hobholt and her co-author is that in most democratic systems, especially in European systems with very complex institutional designs, institutional clarity is not as significantly important anymore. Because people get too used to institutions and they just don't care more what part of branch of power is responsible for certain outcomes. They just evaluate the actions of national executives. And thus they distinguish and they outline the governmental clarity. And they measure it by a compound index which illustrates how coherent and united is the government, the national government at a concrete point of time, and to what extent it exercises power. And in this research, I also decided to focus only on governmental clarity because it proved to be more important in recent studies and because governments are expected to handle more power during COVID-19 pandemic. In general, when the economy is in decline, citizens start to be more critical to governments. But on the initial state of a pandemic or in a crisis, there can be a rally around the flag. This is an effect when people unite around national leaders, especially presidents, when they are faced with very uncertain and especially international events. And there is evidence from the current research of a rally around flag in different contexts. Also, there is some research notice the rise of both diffuse and specific support in Western European systems. However, when the pandemic and economic decline escalates, the rally is undermined because it's usually short-lived on time, and the hyper-accountability effect may come in power. This is an effect when governments started to be very harsh punished for economy. And this effect was mainly studied on example of Central, Eastern and European region, which survived a quite harmful transition from plan to market. So, and considering all that and the quite ambiguous formation of trust, maybe because of the present rally effect and later hyper accountability, I've decided that it's quite interesting to analyze how usually trust is formulated during current events. And drawing from the theory, I outlined several hypotheses. The first kind of bulk of hypotheses relates to clarity of responsibility. And I presumed that better clarity of governmental responsibility leads to lower trust in governments during pandemic. because people are more likely to blame the governments as the main actors implementing the anti-COVID policies in systems with better governmental clarity. While the opposite can maybe also be true, but better clarity of governmental responsibility leads to greater and more stable trust in governments, because contextually people might experience the rally around the flag or just positively evaluate the united governments able to respond to the crisis and introduce measures to combat the pandemic. The other set of hypotheses is connected with severity of a crisis, and it's a bit disputable how the severity of a crisis actually impacts the trust formation. And this hypothesis derived from the recent research has found that deaths from the COVID are negatively connected with trust, while the cases of a novel COVID virus leads to higher governmental trust. And the second hypothesis here is mostly related, probably contextually, with the rally around the flag, that people are faced with such an unexpected situation that they value more their governments. And the last set of hypotheses is connected with the economy. And I presumed that economic impact of the lockdowns measured in unemployment especially, and also subjective estimate of economic well-being, has undermined the trust in governments. And the rise of unemployment and financial anxiety leads to lower trust. However, it may be also true that economic impact doesn't really influence trust formation. And the causal mechanism behind the second hypothesis may be the fact that people understand that regulation of the economy is partially beyond the governmental control, especially especially in European Union, where EU regulates a considerable part of economic affairs. And also because people may rally around the flag, and maybe they can just not feel all the economic impacts on the initial state of the pandemic. It takes time for them to realize how economy impact their personal situation. And these hypotheses were tested by multi-level regression analysis. First of all, this is a kind of regression analysis which allows combining two levels of data, and there were like individual level, first of all, and country level on the second. And the survey on which this research relies on also has these two levels. This is a unique survey conducted by Eurofund agency on the pandemic onset, called Living, Working, and COVID-19. And it was conducted in 2 rounds when the pandemic began last year. And they measured trust on quite very used scale from 0 to 10, where 0 indicates the lowest possible trust and 10 the highest. And on the second country level, beside of country, there was also measured such variable as clarity of governmental responsibility. This is a compound index deriving from the literature, which varies from 0, like the least clear composition of a government, and to 1, the most clear. And this index is composed of 4 indicators. It was coded, for example, if a government is run by coalition or single party, the percentage of seats held by prime minister were also accounted for. Also, it comprises how ideological coherent is the current government and how polarized it is. And for example, if the value is 1, it is the most clear formation of a government. The government is run usually by single party. Prime minister enjoys the major decision-making power, and it's very ideologically coherent. And severity of a crisis, as I said, was measured in COVID cases and deaths per million. And there were also economic indicators from the survey, and these are variables measured as categories. This is loss of job, one of the most important indicator, and respondents answered if they lost the job permanently, temporarily, or they didn't lose the job during the pandemic. And there are also subjective feelings of economic performance, such as job insecurity. It was quoted if a respondent feels insecure about losing a job during pandemic, and estimator of a financial situation in the last and next 3 months of a pandemic. And also some control variables were included on the individual levels as age, education, sex, urbanization status, and individual health. And before proceeding to the results of multi-level analysis, here are some descriptive statistics I wanted to show. On this graph, you can see all the EU member states and residents of which participated in the survey. And here countries are ranked by the trust in governments they experience in the first survey round. And the color of the bar indicates, for example, if it's dark blue, it indicates that trust has declined in the second measurement, while if it's like light blue, it indicates that the trust has risen. And it's ranked from the lowest trust to the highest. And in general, we can see a slight decline of trust, a slight decline of the dependent variable on the second survey compared to the first one. Survey round from 477 to 463. And in general, so-called front runners in trust are Nordic countries, Finland, Denmark, and Sweden that participated in the survey, and also Luxembourg. They held the leading position in the EU. However, Nordic countries, and especially Finland, experienced one of the most dramatic decline in trust in the second round by approximately 1 point of trust. However, the most distrusted governments across EU are in Central and Eastern Europe, especially in Poland and Hungary, which occupy the bottom of a rating. And the only countries which experienced the rise of trust in the second survey are Spain, Luxembourg, France, and especially Estonia and Netherlands. In other countries, in EU, trust in governments has declined. And so this is just a basic overview of country situations. But if we analyze the general picture for all of the states, here are some results. And for example, on the first plot, you can see the model estimates, the coefficients estimate, and if they are marked as red, it indicates that they have like a negative sign and they negatively impact trust, while the blue color indicates it positively. And to sum up, we can see that female gender compared to male one, the average level of education, the better expectations of personal finances in the next and last 3 months, and as well as average clarity of governmental responsibility and COVID cases lead to improvement of trust. While age, especially middle ages and more than 50, if a person has more than 50, is more than 50 age old, the bad individual health, living in the countryside, feeling job insecurity, and especially losing job permanently or temporarily during pandemic, and expecting their finances to worsen, as well as COVID deaths also negatively impact formation of trust. And very significant relationship is found between interaction of losing job, especially permanently, or and also temporarily, but effect is a bit slower, and average clarity of responsibility. So it can be interpreted that if a person has lost a job on the pandemic onset, and he or she lives in averagely better clarity system, so it's quite obvious maybe for him or her to understand that it's the national government has something to do with the economy. They tend to distrust in governments more. And on the second plot, here is some estimators of intercepts for countries. And we can see the positive estimators for such countries as Sweden, Sweden and Slovenia is actually the only country from Central and Eastern European region which has like a positive coefficient. Also Portugal, Luxembourg, Ireland, Finland, Denmark, Estonia have positive signs. And negative estimators are for the majority of Central and Eastern European region, and among Western Europe, it's Belgium, France, and Spain, which has a negative relationship. Well, in this research, I haven't studied the case studies particularly. I think it can be a very interesting opportunity for the next research to explore the country cases qualitatively. And to go forward, this interaction, actually probably the most interesting part of the research between losing job and trust in government, is illustrated on the first graph. And here you can see, for example, the blue line and green lines indicate that the blue line indicate that a person didn't lose a job during pandemic. The green line indicates that they lost it temporarily, and the red line that they lost it permanently. And for first two categories, these two categories tend to trust governments higher in systems with better clarity of responsibility. So I interpret this finding that such people appreciate more united and coherent governments during pandemic, which probably can better respond to the pandemic. Maybe they spend less time on decision making. While people who lost the job permanently tend to distrust significantly lower under such governments. So maybe they better link the loss of job and the fact that their governments are more united, and they tend to blame such governments more. However, we can see that the discrepancies are almost minor in systems with very blurred clarity of responsibility. So under very polarized and not coherent government composed of many parties, all of the respondents don't really understand who is responsible for what, especially in the pandemic times when we witness a lot of information coming from many sources and a lot of factors mixing up. And only losing job and unemployment became such an important factor, because such subjective factors as finances and job insecurity, job anxiety, don't show such trends. For both of these categories, people tend to trust higher under more coherent governments. And unemployment is like the crucial factor that determines how people perceive the governmental responsibility and how they blame governments. And considering that, we can approve the hypothesis that better clarity leads to lower trust in governments. But this proves to be true only for this category of people who permanently lost the job, while other people tend to appreciate more coherent governments. And also, as it was shown, both COVID cases and COVID deaths proves to be significant factors. And while cases are positively connected with the trust, and deaths from the virus tend to be connected negatively. And concerning economy, it proves to be that the worse is economy, the worse is trust. So economy still is an important factor during the COVID. And even such subjective factors of job insecurity and personal finances are negatively connected with trust. And interestingly, when the pandemic started and the first round of a survey was conducted, people had higher estimates, that they estimated higher that their finance are going to be worse in the next 3 months. And when pandemic escalated and maybe some of them understood that actually things are not so bad, for some people, their expectations about personal finances and job insecurities started to be a bit higher. And to conclude, it proves to be that personal financial situation is a crucial factor determining governmental trust, and especially the interaction between clarity of government responsibility and employment. Because this finding partially disagree with a theory which says that trust is usually lower under more coherent governments, because people better understand that these governments may be responsible for the problems, and especially economic problems they have. And the potential development for further research may be including respondents' partisanship in the analysis. Unfortunately, in this survey, the partisanship factor wasn't available, while the research says that partisanship very significantly determines trust, because people usually trust higher incumbents who share the same party as they are. So they trust higher the people for whom they voted. It's quite disputable how significant this factor is consensual democracies, because some research shows that it's not so significant as, for example, in two-party systems. But still, it can be an interesting development for further research. And while age proves to be quite not really, like it proves to be significant factors, but the discrepancies between age groups are quite minor. In general, people of older age distrust higher in governments during pandemic. And it's also quite interesting study, quite interesting finding in my view, because these are young people who are more likely to lose the job during pandemic or to be unemployed and don't find the job, especially during pandemic. And these people are also more likely, if we remember Norris' concept of critical citizens, they are more likely to be critical citizens and in general more distrust more in governments and demand more, for example, environmental protection for governments, like other issues than the basic economic income. And the previous research on the Great Recession, for example, showed that people of older age were also more distrustful during the Great Recession, because they are more likely to have conservative values and they are somehow more sensitive to economic business cycles. And also considering the context of pandemic, urbanization and health status are other individual factors that affect trust negatively. So people with relatively worse individual health and living in the countrysides are more distrustful. And apparently, I expected to find that variation among countries, among European countries, is going to be more significant than variations among individuals, because these are the national countries who manage the pandemic on the national level, which close the borders, and we see how many different paths which governments have taken around the world. So theoretically, it was expected that variations among countries are more substantial, but apparently it proved to be that variations among individuals and their individual and economic and social demographic factors are more significant than variations among countries. And this is also an interesting opportunity for the next research. So yeah, I think it's all. Thank you very much for listening, and hopefully I made myself clear, and looking forward for your comments. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Valeria, for your very concise presentation. And actually, it turns out to be quite dense. I do have a number of questions still. So, but without any further ado, Maria, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me all good? Yes. Okay, let me just get my notes. Well, first of all, thank you for my part also for this very interesting presentation. And I think it's very nice to see that you have advanced to this point in your research since our last meeting in fall. I think it was in November that we had this meeting. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to also take part of these results of yours and see how your work has evolved. It was very nice to see. Now, it's of course, it's a bit difficult to only have read the summary. I haven't read the full text of your thesis, so I recognize and I realize that some of these comments may be redundant because you probably have taken them into account in the full text. And actually some of them you somewhat answered during your presentation. But since the paper was all that I got, so you have to just settle with these comments that are based on the paper that you sent me. But first of all, before proceeding to any details, I would like to ask you this. What do you feel is the most important finding of your research? And what do you think is the main contribution if you think about trust research in general or the effects of economy and so forth? What do you feel is the most important of your findings?
Oh, thank you, Maria, for a very great question.
It's a difficult one, I always say, but it's a matter of opinion sometimes also. But
sure. And yeah, first of all, thank you for this conversation we had in autumn. It was very helpful for me, especially when the scheme you provided me how to make these multi-level models was very helpful, especially, and the book on Nordic Water was also, I really enjoyed reading it and it was very helpful. This is, answering your question, I was thinking that the main contribution is probably this interaction between clarity and losing job, because it was quite unexpected for me to see these discrepancies between categories and to see that people you actually appreciate more coherent governments during crisis times. That's how I interpreted this interaction, and it would be very interesting to analyze, for example, the data after a year of pandemic and how this works, if it works, for example, in a year after pandemic, when probably this the rally flag around the flag, which I don't really have like as an indicator in my analysis, but maybe if it was there, if it's kind of present or not after a year, and maybe the trust became lower in all countries. So yeah, I was thinking that this interaction is kind of probably the main contribution, because in the usual times it proves like absolutely the opposite. For example, the Hobart and Sarah Hobart and her co-authors showed that actually, yeah, it's the lower, when the clarity is better, for example, people tend to distrust the governments more. So it acts the opposite. So it's probably the main unexpected finding for me, first of all. Yeah, and probably the main contribution in my view.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Maybe we can get back to that. I have some questions of your variables and more detailed stuff, but we can get back to this at the end. My second comment or question, if you will, is about this contextual background. First, when it comes to the pandemic as a context of studying this, and secondly, when we analyze different countries. Now, I understand that you're interested in somehow unraveling the effect of the corona pandemic on this political or governmental trust. However, I was thinking when reading this paper that are you truly, or do you think that you're truly able to do so with this data? Because I see, of course, that the data is collected in two waves during the pandemic, but when analyzing the effect of different variables on trust in government, how do you know if some effects are the result of the pandemic or not? You mentioned, for instance, that I think it was for Finland that trust has remarkably decline between these two waves. But do you know that this is a consequence of the pandemic, or could it be something else? Because just in order to determine that, I would assume that you would have to compare somehow this data with the situation that was prevalent before the pandemic. And let me get back to this, but this leads me to the next question. We know from previous research on trust that there are differences between countries when it comes to government levels of trust, and that those differences have existed long before the coronavirus, of course. So have you, in your theoretical section of your thesis, have you discussed these differences between countries that existed prior to the corona crisis? And do you see that, or are you able to say that the coronavirus has in some way affected these levels of trust, or made differences bigger or smaller between countries? Because I would assume it's not possible to do with only using this data. So just as I said, I don't see how you could say that much about the effect of the pandemic without comparing to some other data from a time before the pandemic. So in other words, my question here is that how much do you feel that you can confidently say about these countries and their levels of trust, and that how they have been affected by this, or the trust levels have been affected by the pandemic? Or is it just some natural cycles of trust? We know, for instance, that economic variables tend to be quite strong predictors of political trust. So are you able to discern the effects of the pandemic from the natural cycles and variations that happen with trust in different countries? It's a difficult question. I'm not sure if I was able to formulate it correctly, but the point is that can you say that the effects are something that are happening now because of the pandemic, or could it be just something else that you're not able to grasp with this data? Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, I do. Thank you. That's a really good point. And yeah, that's probably that pandemic acts here just like as a context. So it's not like it's not a specific variable. So it's just like severity of a crisis controlled as indicators, but no more variables. And it's probably also the nature of the data, and which was measured quite very precise and short moment of time.
Sure.
And it would be definitely better and more proficient to analyze the trust before and trust during pandemic, for example, and especially on election results, for example. And it's, for example, European social survey. It's like they expected to measure it, but it's gonna appear, I think, in a year or maybe later. Yeah, so it'd be like better to, for example, to compare the survey round before the pandemic and then the pandemic, because in this Eurofound survey, no such data was available. Unfortunately, to determine the kind of pandemic effect,
Yes.
and to determine it kind of in a more confident way.
I understand. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just sorry to interrupt you. I was just thinking that, of course, I understand that now the pandemic is still ongoing, and some of these effects are perhaps effects that we will only understand afterwards. So I have complete understanding that this is a kind of first step in analyzing this situation, and this might be there's a gap for you to further your research with, for instance, in your doctoral or possible doctoral project, where you can take into account a wider time frame also, to really understand what effects are effects of the pandemic and which are not. So I do understand, but I think that it might be good to be a little bit careful in the wording when you draw your conclusions and how you write it, just so that the reader understands that this really, that what you're able to say with this data and what not. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. That's definitely it is, and especially the trust that was measured. It's definitely like very specific trust. It's not like a long-term trust, even in governments. It's very specific time, and which can naturally fluctuates because of different factors and different like national factors, for example, national conflicts or corruption scandals or some different events. And yeah, it's very precise here and not probably connected in a bigger context with long-term trust. Like it is connected, but in this specific survey, it's kind of like more about, I think, confidence in governments when the pandemic started.
Okay. Well, just I would love to discuss this further, but I guess we have to move on a little bit. So I have a comment on your hypothesis. Personally, I'm not, and this might be a matter of opinion too. So science is also about opinions sometimes. But personally, I'm not a big fan of having this opposing hypothesis because to me, it tends to be a sign of the fact that the author is not all that familiar, perhaps, with the theory. Sometimes it might sometimes be motivated if there are indeed clear and opposite possibilities for something to happen, that they have clear theoretical underpinnings, a bit like what you have for your hypothesis 1A and B. But I think that opposing hypothesis should be used in moderation if there's not a clear theoretical reason for having this opposing, because it feels a little bit like having this opposing hypothesis. It feels to me always like the author wants to keep a little bit every door open, that you want to confirm some hypothesis. And of course, it's nice to have our hypothesis verified, but if we have a hypothesis that is falsified or that doesn't gain support, it's still a good result. So I don't see the need to have this opposing hypothesis if there's not a clear theoretical reason to do that. Still, as I said, this might be a little bit of an opinion, but sometimes, I think that the best hypothesis, they come from the theory. And if you don't, for instance, for your hypothesis 2 and 3, I think you mentioned in your presentation a little bit about the causal mechanism, but it didn't come through very clearly in your summary paper that you sent. I wasn't sure how to interpret this, that you have that the amount of deaths is negatively related with trust, whereas the cases are positively or lead to higher governmental trust. So I didn't quite understand the rationale behind these hypotheses as it was put in the paper. Does it have to do with rallying behind the flag somehow, or the government's success or failure in avoiding deaths, even though we have these COVID contractions or cases of COVID? So it wasn't too clear to me how these mechanisms worked here. So I thought it was a little bit strange having these very similar hypotheses, but with the opposite direction, basically. It might be that I read it too. I didn't understand what I read, but it didn't come out very clear to me in your paper. So would you like to
Yeah,
explain the...
Yeah, I can comment. Yeah, it's probably also because the paper I sent you was quite shortened, and I didn't want to overload you with all the phases.
Sure. Yes.
Yeah, but you're absolutely true in this observation, and also from the first hypothesis. Kind of like the first part of the first hypothesis is mainly from the clarity of responsibility theory, while the second part and this second set of hypotheses derived from literature review on pandemic. So it's kind of very recent research on pandemic it started to appear, and some of it, of course, isn't really very like theoretically founded, because just people started to do empirical research first of all when such events started to appear. And it derives from the literature review that current studies found that the amount of cases is connected with a higher trust, because maybe people, like this research argues that people experience rally around the flag. And that's why when the pandemic began in many states, they noticed such a connection. And the opposite is with deaths, because deaths appears to be like psychologically kind of very harsh mechanism for a person, that the higher amount of deaths probably acts as a signal for people that probably government does something wrong, that it can't stop the amount of deaths, and that's why the trust declines contextually, that too many deaths maybe indicate that the government doesn't really work good to stop them.
Okay.
But I absolutely agree that it's quite disputable how this acts and how this mechanism acts, because it's not really supported by the theory, and also this mechanism also probably not very supported by the theory in my research too. I just relied on the literature review, but not very profound theories on this causal mechanism.
Yeah, okay, and I also understand, of course, that in a new field of research, there might not be any very clear hypothesis to test, and it's an empirical question, whatever the results is. So I get that. But proceeding to some more detailed questions, and maybe related to this as well, a little bit on the variables that you use in your research. First, in your theory section, you mentioned Easton's conceptualization of political support, and you mentioned that you distinguish between support measured in the surveys as dichotomous phenomenon. But I don't quite understand what you mean by this. I assume you mean the differentiation between diffuse and specific support, but I didn't find a discussion on how you see these related to trust in government. How do you define this political support, and do you have any empirical measures of this support? And further, what conclusions do you draw from your results regarding trust in government and system support? Do you see trust in government as a form of system support? And if you do so, do you see it as specific or diffuse? Or do I understand it correctly, that this is how you interpret Easton's conceptualization of political support? How do you see that trust and support are connected? And if they are, what kind of support is this trust in government?
Yeah, thank you for the question and for the comment. It's kind of this distinction between dichotomous, like binary measurement, and quite a more specific measurement on a larger scale. For example, as in this survey, trust varies from 0 to 10. I made this distinction because this was like part of a literature review that usually support, for example, support for democracy and is measured by survey question, how much do you support democracy as a form of government? And actually the answer can may be yes or no, for example, quite a very binary measurement. And trust acts as more continuous measurement, especially like trust in governments, like to what scale, to what degree you can trust governments, a government, for example, or a president or prime minister. So this distinction was made just to underline how support and trust can be measured in different ways. And here, yes, the trust is on specific level and on very specific context. And but it would be interesting if we consider after it, for example, a bigger picture and the other data before the pandemic and after and during and hopefully after it one day. It would be also probably to draw up conclusions on more diffuse support and support on in governments in general and support in national incumbents in general, and probably more specifically also in democracy, more in a more diffuse level. Yeah.
Yes, I think I sort of understand. Then again, I don't know. I always find I've been studying political trust for the past 10 or 15 years, or trust in general, and I always find Easton's categorizations quite abstract and not always very practical. And maybe I prefer the terms, just using the terms trust, because to me it's more, it's less abstract than the system support. But if you bring these Easton's conceptualizations into the discussion, I think it's important that you are very clear with what you mean by this system support and how these are connected, because it's sometimes it's a little bit confusing. At least it is to me. Maybe it's not to everybody, but to me it's a little bit abstract.
Then, thank you. It's like
I also have sure. Sorry.
No, I just was thankful for the observation. It's definitely
okay.
Good to be more concrete.
Yeah. Then I have some questions regarding the economic variables and what you called governmental clarity. And I really like the fact that you have brought this something new for me, at least to an extent in this discussion. And I think that it's very interesting that you included these variables in your analysis. But I did find the theoretical discussion of maybe a little bit simplistic. And again, I'm sure that you have developed the discussion much more, and it's much more nuanced in your full text paper. But you write on page 2, you have this passage on the system or the government clarity. You have this passage where you say that, or you write that systems with proportional representation and multiple parties, multi-level governance, and institutions with exceptionally balanced powers blur responsibility, causing a challenge for citizens to link actors and policies. And further, you say that consensual democracies allow higher representation and are characterized by a more complex institutional design that ensures higher government trust. And in contrast, majoritarian two-party systems with enhanced roles of the executive provide more accountability. Still, they tend to suffer from lower levels of trust in authorities, since it's more evident for voters whom to blame for a crisis. So I think that while all of this may be true, I would have liked to see some discussion on how these different traits of political systems actually play together, and perhaps they even cancel each other out in terms of governmental trust. For instance, yes, proportional systems might be perceived as more complex, and perhaps the systems of accountability in proportional systems are seen as not as as clearly as in majoritarian systems, and hence they might affect trust in government in a negative way. But then there are several arguments that actually say the opposite, that proportional systems, they allow for different views. They are more equal in terms for smaller parties to come through. There's more inclusion, which in turn then are beneficial for government trust. So in other words, don't you think that these indicators might cancel each other out in a little bit, or in some way? What is more important for trust? Is it accountability, or is it this inclusion or equality? And also, I don't know, I'm not personally entirely convinced that majoritarian systems per definition are just more accountable systems, basically. I don't know, I would think that there are many different factors at play, and I think you mentioned this in your presentation also, that we have different countries with different political cultures and different political institutional landscapes. And just, I don't know, I think that there are so many different system level factors that may or may not affect trust, and they might cancel each other out. So I would like to see some discussion on that. And then another thing is that you derive quite a lot or much of the discussion from this economic voting theory, which I think is fine. But do you think that people apply the same rationale when they evaluate the trust in government as they do when they vote or choose their candidates or make their decisions on voting? At least, I don't know, I would assume that it's not necessarily the same thing to evaluate the role of the government or place your trust in government as it is to make voting choices. So I don't know, I think that these may be related phenomena, but perhaps a discussion on how this theory of economic voting actually, is it, or how compatible is it with this idea of placing trust in government? I don't know, I feel that I'm not able to communicate my questions very clearly here. I'm thinking aloud. Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I understood your questions. Yeah, very good. I'm just like listening, because very, very interesting points to consider.
Yeah, just I think it's just a matter of just having the discussion. I mean, you may choose to still use the theory of economic voting, but just, be very open about the fact that there may be other alternative interpretations and alternative interpretations of what actually matters for trust, and have this discussion. So I think that's important, and I'm sure that you have done at least something of that in your thesis, so I'm not all that worried about it, and it makes sense to me what you have written. But just as from this paper, I would have liked to read more about this.
Yeah, that's true. This paper is very short, and that all the work, and yeah, I've made in the main work quite a big probably literature review on how this political factors and different institutions, proportional systems or multi-level systems, how they impact trust, because it's definitely a lot of research on it and very many factors, and I found also many contradictions in this. So there is no a final point, that it's kind of more or less common points that in majoritarian systems they provide more accountability, but concessional systems provide more representation. And this also I mentioned this discussion about accountability and inclusivity. That's quite important too, as you mentioned. And that's interesting that actually how majoritarian systems, if they are definitely more accountable nowadays, or probably proportional systems are also very much too. So I didn't really consider, I think, this point, but I covered this discussion, but that's definitely many things to talk about here.
Sure. And I guess sorry.
No, go on.
I get so carried away. No, just also I think that when we discuss accountability, it's also about, is it a subjective view of the citizens or the voters, or is it an objective measure? Because I have a hard time accepting the idea that proportional systems are in fact less accountable than majoritarian system objectively. They might be from the citizens' perspective, but I'm not sure if they are automatically so from an objective perspective. I think that there's many differences between countries. We have proportional systems that do not work well, that have very little accountability, but we have the same with majoritarian systems. And so I guess that there are these country differences that may, and how you define accountability. Is it a subjective view of the citizens, or is it the objective version of just how we define accountability and how it's measured?
Yeah, that's true. And here, for example, this I think here the main arguments of this clarity of responsibility debate derives from Powell and Wheaton, who in 1993 published their first paper with political factors determine economic voting, and also Leiphart and his contribution about majoritarian and proportional systems. And here, for example, this clarity index is also might be very disputable how good it measures. And it's more, I think, about accountability here, this clarity index. So it's quite of very, tries to be objective indicator. So if the government run by a single party or coalition and so on, but it can also be subjective. And there is some research carried on in the Netherlands when researchers asked people in surveys to answer surveys questions, for example, to what extent they feel they evaluate government accountable for economy, for example, healthcare, environment, and so on. And they also plotted the difference between different sectors and different policies. And then they measured clarity at this kind of subjective way. And this is also kind of very interesting research, and quite interesting also to compare probably this subjective evaluations of clarity and objective of accountability on this quite a very precise indicators. For example, proportion of seats held by parties and effective number of parties and so on. But this is definitely a big thing to consider and to develop for, I think.
Okay. So moving on to the results, and I promise I will give this short, and actually I guess my main concerns here regarding the results were the fact that, well, what I already discussed and you already answered about the context of the pandemic and how much of the results you can actually derive from the pandemic and whatnot. We already addressed this issue of the crisis context and the non-crisis context, so I'm not going to go into that in any further depth. But just one final comment about the results, and this is at the end of your text, you conclude that in the analysis it appears that variation within countries is more considerable than variation between them. So I did not understand this. I thought that you meant that you also had somehow taken into account some sub-national entities like regions or something, but you're referring to individual level differences, which is fine. But since this is a multi-level regression that you have conducted, it would have been helpful to read a little bit about the effects of each level and some goodness of fit of your model. Otherwise, it's quite difficult to say whether or not your conclusion is right about the main differences being at the individual level and not at the country level. And I think that on one of your slides, you actually had some of the statistics about these levels, so which was good, but I didn't have the time to analyze or take yes, exactly. So I didn't have a time to think about those, but I'm assuming that you have more tables and figures in your full text version of your thesis, also with these concrete regression coefficients and p-values of significance. And so I wasn't able to evaluate those independently from the text. So if you could say something about the general just the goodness of this. I can see it now, but I wasn't able to see it before, so it's very interesting to also see this.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I made myself unclear, probably in the summary I sent you. Yeah, I just wanted to be coherent and
of course, I understand.
A lot of papers to read. But yeah, it was this conclusion is made from results of multi-level analysis, so it wasn't on this stage at least depth case studies and comparison of countries, but quite a very statistical finding that this ICC indicator that actually shows if country level or individual level explains more variation, and it turns out that it's quite low, so it's on individual level and among respondents the variations are more significant than on the country level, so it's kind of very statistical finding and conclusion in this stage. So yeah, and yeah, I do have big kind of tables with all indicators and p-values in phases, but here I just wanted to make it more visible and public friendly, let's say.
Yes, I assumed you had it. It was just because I love statistics and I'm always interested.
I should send you.
Yes, please do, so I can take part of this. And sorry for taking up so much time on this discussion. I have smaller comments, but maybe I can just send them to you as these track changes comments in your paper if you're still interested in seeing them. I don't know if your thesis is already finished. I'm not sure if you want any.
Really, I have a month before submission, so
yes. So I can send them separately. But thank you. It was very interesting too, and I think you have done a very good job with this. So
thank you very much for the comments. I can send you forward and we can continue the discussion after it, but
thank you. That's it for me.
Oh, wow, that was impressive. So thank you so much, Maria, and for this wonderful discussion.